The morning they read the will, it was raining in Pittsburgh. Not the soft kind of rain that makes you think of gardens and open windows. The hard gray kind that comes in October, that turns the sidewalks black and makes the whole city look like it's been left out too long. The kind of rain that doesn't apologize for anything. Harriet Voss sat in a chair that was too soft and too low, the kind of chair designed to make you feel small before anyone even opens their mouth. She was 68 years old. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her coat was clean, but it was the only coat she owned, and she had worn it so many times that the collar had begun to fray at the left edge in a way she kept meaning to fix and never did. She had signed the papers for the house that morning. 35 years she had lived in that house on Clement Street. She had raised no children in it, but she had grown old in it, which is its own kind of raising. She had painted every room at least twice. She had fixed the front step herself after her husband Walter couldn't anymore. She had kept the garden going long after keeping it going stopped making any practical sense, because the roses her mother had given her as a cutting were growing there and she couldn't bear to let them go. Walter had died 2 years ago. He had left behind a man's usual mess of good intentions and bad paperwork. The debts were not enormous. They were just large enough to take the house. So she had signed the papers. She had handed the pen back to the man behind the desk, and she had said thank you because that was the kind of woman she was. And she had walked out into the rain and walked 3 blocks to the office of one Gerald Fenwick, attorney at law, to hear about an inheritance she had not known was coming. The office smelled like old carpet and pipe tobacco. There was a young woman at the front desk with neat hair and a sympathetic expression that didn't reach her eyes. She brought Harriet a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been made sometime yesterday. Gerald Fenwick was a thin man with reading glasses he kept taking on and off as if the world looked better slightly blurred. He had a file folder on his desk. He opened it carefully the way people open things they are not sure will hold together. He explained the situation in the measured, slightly apologetic tone of a man delivering news he knows will not land well. Her grandmother, Margaret Crane Voss, known to most of Tucker County, West Virginia, as Maggie, known to the rest of Tucker County as something considerably less kind. Dead 2 years ago at the age of 93, the estate had taken time to locate the sole surviving heir. 47 acres, Tucker County, a cabin, some outbuildings in various states of repair, creek frontage. He paused there, cleared his throat. The property, he said, carried certain local associations. He said it the way doctors say there are some things we should discuss. The land was steep, rocky. The cabin had not been maintained in the final years of Margaret's life. There was a history of the property being considered by locals somewhat. He searched for the word, unusual. That was when the young woman at the front desk made the sound. It was small. She covered it quickly with her hand, but it was unmistakable. A laugh pressed down but not entirely contained the way water finds cracks in old pipes. Harriet looked at her. The young woman looked at her desk. Fenwick kept talking. Something about assessed value and access roads in the county recorder's office. Harriet was not listening to the words anymore. She was looking at her hands folded there in her lap, and she was thinking about the house on Clement Street, which was no longer hers, and the roses that were still growing in the garden, which she would not be able to tend, and the fact that she had $23 in her purse and nowhere in particular to be. She was 68 years old. She had nowhere to go, and the only thing standing between her and that fact was 47 acres of rocky hillside in a part of West Virginia she had never visited, which a young woman she had never met found funny enough to laugh at. Harriet looked up at Gerald Fenwick and said very quietly, "Tell me about the land." He told her. She listened. And then she asked the question she had not intended to ask because she had not known there was a question to ask until he mentioned that the estate had taken time to locate the heir, and something in the phrasing snagged on something inside her like a nail in old wood. She asked, had her grandmother tried to contact her before? Fenwick took his glasses off, put them back on, opened the file folder to a different page. Yes, he said, twice. The first letter had been sent in 1906 when Harriet was 22 years old, recently gone from the Methodist care home in Pittsburgh where she had spent most of her childhood. The letter had been sent to that address. It had been returned. The second letter had been sent in 1918, returned again. Both times the return had come from the same source, a director, Alma Reese of the Methodist Home for Girls on Whitmore Street. Harriet sat very still. She had left that home in 1904. She had been 20 years old and she had walked out the front door with a carpet bag and $4 in the firm intention of never thinking about the place again. She had mostly succeeded, but Alma Reese had kept her forwarding address, had filed it somewhere in that gray building in one of those gray filing cabinets, had kept it as institutions keep things not because they intend to use them, but because throwing things away requires a decision, and decisions require energy. And twice a letter had come. Twice it had been returned. Not lost, returned. Harriet sat with that for a moment. The rain was still coming down outside the window. The young woman at the front desk had gone very quiet. She asked Fenwick if there was anything else. He hesitated. Then he reached into the folder and produced a second envelope, smaller than the others. Old. The paper had gone soft with age, and the edges had that particular worn quality of something that has been handled, set down, picked up, and finally put away somewhere safe for a very long time. It was addressed to her. Harriet Voss, care of the Methodist Home for Girls, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The handwriting was small and careful and slightly forward-leaning, as if the letters were walking somewhere with some purpose. The postmark read 1918. The envelope had never been opened. Fenwick slid it across the desk toward her without a word. Harriet looked at it for a long time before she picked it up. She did not open it there. She put it in her coat pocket next to her $23, and she thanked Gerald Fenwick for his time, and she stood up and walked out into the Pittsburgh rain, and she did not cry because she had learned a long time ago that crying in front of people, even people who were not looking at you, was a kind of gift you gave them, and she was not feeling generous. She walked 3 blocks to the bus station. She bought a ticket to Parsons, West Virginia. It cost $4.50. She had $18.50 left. She sat on a bench and waited for the bus and felt the envelope in her pocket, that soft old paper, that careful handwriting, and she thought about a woman she had never met who had tried to find her twice and failed both times and had still apparently left her 47 acres in a cabin in the mountains. The bus came. She got on. She did not look back at Pittsburgh. The mountains began 2 hours out of the city, rising up around the highway with a kind of slow authority, the way old things assert themselves. Not dramatically, not all at once, just steadily, insistently, until you realized the world had changed around you and you couldn't say exactly when it had happened. Harriet had grown up in the flat parts of Pennsylvania. She had married a man from Ohio. She had spent her life in places where the horizon was something you could see, where the land made room for you. These mountains did not make room. They pressed in from every direction, ridge after ridge, each one darker and more forested than the last. The trees so thick they turned afternoon light into something closer to dusk. She watched them out the window and thought about her grandmother, Margaret Crane Voss. Maggie. She had heard the name exactly once in her life, spoken by her father's sister at a funeral for someone else, entirely mentioned in passing as an example of the particular stubbornness that ran in certain branches of the family. Touched her, Aunt had said. Not mean about it. Just matter of fact, the way you described the weather. Maggie Voss went up into those mountains and never came back down again, and everyone said she wasn't right after her husband died, and maybe that was true, and maybe it wasn't, but either way, she was gone. That was all Harriet had ever known. Now she knew there were letters, 2 letters 20 years apart, written to a granddaughter who never received them. The bus pulled into Parsons at 2:30 in the afternoon. The town was smaller than she expected. A main street with a general store, a diner, a hardware shop, a church with a white steeple that needed painting. Mountains pressing in from every direction, so close, the town felt like something dropped into a bowl and left there. The air was different, thinner, colder. And there was a smell to it she couldn't name, wood smoke and iron and something green and living underneath something that the mountains were exhaling. She found a man with a truck who agreed to take her partway up Backbone Mountain for $2. His name was on a hand-lettered sign on the truck's door. Dewey Marsh Hauling. He said maybe 10 words during the drive, which suited Harriet fine. The road switchbacked up the mountain's western face, each turn steeper than the last, the drop-off growing more serious, the trees closing in. After 40 minutes, the truck stopped. This is as far as I go, the man said. Harriet looked out the window. There was nothing but trees and a track she could barely distinguish from the surrounding undergrowth, a depression in the leaf litter more than a road. How far to the property? She asked. Another mile and a half up that track, he said. Past the old Greenway place. You'll know it when you see it. He paused. I'd advise you not to go poking around after dark. Why not, she said. He didn't answer, just waited while she climbed out with her suitcase and turned the truck around in a space that seemed too narrow for turning and drove back down the mountain. She listened to the engine fade. Then it was gone and there was only the wind in the trees and her own breathing and the sound of her suitcase wheels on frozen ground. And the silence was enormous. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence of something very large and very old that had been there long before she arrived and had no particular interest in making her feel welcome. She started walking. The track was overgrown and the light was already going amber by the time the trees opened up into a clearing. She stopped at the edge of it and looked. They had called it the witch's nest. She understood why. The cabin sat in the center of the clearing, and it had the look of something that had been assembled with great purpose and very little concern for what other people might think of the result. The roof sagged in the middle. Two of the windows were covered with boards. The chimney leaned at an angle that suggested it was thinking seriously about giving up. But that was not what she was looking at. What she was looking at were the structures. Everywhere she turned, woven shapes in various states of decay. An archway over what had once been a garden, its willow branches gray and interlocked, still holding its curve after years of neglect. A half-collapsed tunnel leading toward a woodshed, its ribs bent inward like a basket turned on its side. Strange spiraling forms wrapped around the trunks of dead trees as if someone had been trying to teach the trees something. Curved walls woven between fence posts holding their shape against all reasonable expectation. Some had fallen, piles of rotting sticks returning to the ground. But the ones that still stood, they were remarkable. Not because they were beautiful, though there was something in them that pulled at the eye. They were remarkable because they were clearly not random, not decorative. They had been built to do something. Each curve, each angle, each interlocking branch had been placed with intention. Someone had thought very hard about this. Harriet stood in the fading afternoon light and looked at the structures and felt for the first time in a very long time, curious. Not worried, not afraid, curious. The same feeling she used to get in the Pittsburgh library on her lunch break when she'd pick up something she didn't expect and find it opening up into something much larger than its cover had suggested. She walked toward the cabin. The door hung crooked on its hinges, but it opened when she pushed. Something small and fast moved in the far corner. Mice. The cabin was a single large room with a loft above a cast-iron stove in one corner, a bed frame against the far wall, a table, two chair shelves lined with jars so dusty she couldn't see what was inside them. The floor was packed dirt. The walls had gaps where the chinking had crumbled away. But the stove looked functional, and the roof over at least half the cabin appeared solid. She found a candle stub on the table and lit it with matches from her coat pocket. In the far corner, half buried under debris from a section of collapsed roof, was a cedar chest. She looked at it for a long moment. Everything else in the coin had the quality of abandonment, things left where they'd been put and then forgotten. But the chest was different. It sat under the one section of roof that had held, and it had the quality of something placed rather than forgotten, something protected. She dragged it into the center of the room. It was heavier than she expected. The lid was swollen shut from years of moisture and cold, and she had to work at it with a kitchen knife she found in a drawer, prying carefully at the edges until the seal broke, and the smell came up cedar and old paper and something dry and papery and ancient, the smell of time itself. Inside, 17 notebooks stitched together from various kinds of paper, filled edge to edge with small, forward-leaning handwriting, bundles of letters tied with kitchen string, pressed willow samples between sheets of newspaper, diagrams drawn on the backs of feed store receipts detailed and precise, dried plant specimens with careful labels, and at the very top, set apart from everything else, a package wrapped in brown paper. Harriet picked it up. Her name was on it. Her name in that same careful handwriting. Harriet Voss, care of the Methodist Home for Girls, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This was not the letter from 1918 that was already in her pocket. This was something different. This one was larger, heavier, and this one had been sent and returned and then placed here, deliberately, under the one section of roof that held. Someone had known she might come, even if it took years, even if it took longer than a life. Harriet sat down on the floor of that ruined cabin, the package in her lap, the candle throwing soft, moving light across the walls, and she pressed her hand flat against the brown paper and felt the shape of whatever was inside, and she understood something then. Something she couldn't have put into words yet, but that settled into her chest like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. She was not, it turned out, the last. She was in fact the point. She did not open the package that night. She built a fire in the stove instead. The chimney drew badly, but it drew, and slowly the cabin came up to something approaching warmth. She melted snow for water in a tin cup she found on the shelf. She ate the last of the crackers she'd brought from Pittsburgh. She wrapped herself in a wool blanket from the chest that was moth-eaten but still substantial, and she sat near the stove and opened the first of the 17 notebooks. The handwriting was difficult at first, small and cramped with abbreviations she didn't understand and references that assumed a knowledge she didn't have. But as she read, the voice behind the words came clear, the way voices do once you stop trying to decode them and simply listen. October 3rd, 1885. Bought the land from the county tax sale, 47 acres for $11. The men at the recorder's office thought it was amusing. 3 families had abandoned the property before me, all of them within 2 winters. The land is steep and rocky and not suited for farming in any conventional way. What it is suited for, I am still learning. This is the account of what I learned. Harriet turned the page. November 15th, 1885. First full winter. The wind on this ridge is unlike anything I've encountered at lower elevations. It doesn't simply blow, it thinks. It finds every weakness in a structure, every gap in the chinking, every loose board, every misaligned joint, and it works at those weaknesses with something that resembles patience. The cabin as I found it was poorly designed for this. It fights the wind. The wind wins. I have been watching how the birds build their nests. I have been watching how the beaver builds his lodge. I have been watching how the creek bends around obstacles rather than confronting them. There is something here I am trying to understand. Harriet read until the candle burned low. She read about wind patterns charted over a decade, about the tensile strength of different willow varieties, about a set of Cherokee winter shelters Maggie had studied through the accounts of a missionary who documented them 40 years before. She read about failure structures that had held for 2 weeks and then come apart in a single night, about foundations that heaved in the freeze-thaw cycle, about weave patterns that looked strong but had no give. She read about a passage, not a road, not a hallway, a woven willow tunnel connecting the cabin to the woodshed curved to shed snow, rather than bear it, designed to use the weight of winter rather than fight it. An enclosed walkway that lets you move between buildings in any weather without stepping into the killing cold. Maggie had built and rebuilt it across 30 years, each version better than the last, each failure teaching her something the success couldn't have. November 8th, 1921. Notebook 12. The passage held through the Armistice Day storm, 4 feet overnight. The eastern counties lost barns, lost livestock, lost 2 men, and collapsed structures. My passage stood. The snow loaded onto the curved surface the way it loads onto a hill, not piling up, but sliding away, packing around the base, integrating into the structure rather than crushing it. The wind could find no flat surface to push against. I have been trying to tell people about this for 30 years. I have written papers. I have asked to speak at the county fair. I have demonstrated to anyone who would stand still long enough to watch. No one is interested in what a woman living alone on this mountain has figured out about building. They call me the witch. They mean it as an insult. They are wrong about what it means. Harriet set the notebook down on her knee and looked at the stove and listened to the wind working at the cabin walls, finding the gaps in the chinking, filling the room with cold that pushed against the warmth from the other direction. 30 years. Maggie had spent 30 years solving a problem that killed people, and no one had listened. She reached into her coat pocket and took out the envelope, the one Fenwick had given her, the one postmarked 1918. She opened it. The letter inside was 3 pages written on both sides of each sheet. The handwriting was smaller than the notebooks, more compressed, as if there was a great deal to say and not enough paper to say it on. Harriet, it began, I don't know if this will reach you. The other letter didn't. but I am trying again because you are my son's daughter and I owe you at least one more attempt." She read slowly. Maggie wrote about the land, about what she had built and what she had learned, about the willows along the creek and why she had cultivated them for 30 years, about the shape of the wind on the ridge and how she had taught herself to read it the way a sailor reads water, about the passage and why it worked and why it mattered not for her alone, but for everyone in the valley below who were still building, the same way people had built for 100 years, still putting up flat roofs that collapsed under snow loads, still fighting the mountain and losing. And then near the end of the third page, she wrote this: "I do not know what your life has been. I know it started poorly, and I know that was partly my fault because I let my son go and didn't fight hard enough to follow him, and he took you somewhere I couldn't reach. If you are reading this, you are grown now, and you have made your way without me, and I am proud of that, even though I had nothing to do with it. But the land is yours. What I built is yours. And what I learned, all of it, every winter of it, is in the chest in the notebooks waiting for you. Finish what I started, Harriet. Not for me, for the people in the valley who don't know yet that they need what I've figured out. Your grandmother, Margaret." Harriet folded the letter carefully along its original creases and put it back in the envelope, and put the envelope back in her pocket against her chest. Outside, the wind moved through the willows along the creek with a sound like breath. She had come here with $23 in a suitcase and nowhere else to go. She had thought this might be the end of something. It was possible she was beginning to think that it was the beginning instead. He came the next morning, before she'd had time to do more than rebuild the fire and eat the last of the crackers and step outside to see what 47 acres looked like in daylight. A black automobile, not new but well kept in the way that speaks of money spent on maintenance rather than appearance. A man in a good coat, the kind that costs enough that you don't need to tell people it cost enough. Maybe 55 years old, the kind of face that has spent a long time arranging itself into expressions of friendly reasonableness. He introduced himself as Frank Hollis. He said the name with a particular emphasis as if he expected her to recognize it. He said he'd heard she'd come up the mountain. Word traveled fast in Tucker County, he said, with a smile that suggested he was responsible for some of that travel. He had an offer, a fair offer. He was very clear that it was a fair offer. $800 for the 47 acres, as is no requirement to clear the property. Cash within the week. She asked him why he wanted it. Timber, he said. The ridge had good hardwood. He had the equipment to get it out. It would be a profitable operation for everyone involved. She said she would think about it. The smile stayed on, but something behind his eyes went still in a way that reminded her of a cat that has been watching a bird and has just decided to stop watching. "You should think quickly," he said. "Winter comes fast up here, and the property," he looked at the cabin, at the woven structures decaying in the clearing, "has a history of being difficult for people to maintain, especially people on their own. 3 families had tried it before her grandmother," he said. "None of them lasted 2 winters. He let that sit there for a moment. Then he said it was lovely to meet her and got back in his automobile and drove away down the mountain, the engine sound dropping away in the trees. Harriet stood in the clearing and watched until he was gone. Then she went inside and found Notebook 4, the one that covered the years 1905 through 1912, and she read until she found what she was looking for. It took her 20 minutes. 1921, July. A man came up the mountain. Harold Hollis. He had heard I was improving the property and wanted to discuss purchase. I declined. He returned 3 weeks later and declined to take no for an answer. I declined again with greater clarity. He did not return a third time. But the following spring, I began to hear things in town, that I had gone peculiar, that the structures I'd built were the work of a disordered mind, that the property was cursed, that the land itself was wrong, and that everyone who tried to live on it was eventually broken by it. None of this was new, but it was louder than before, and it seemed to come from a particular direction. Harold Hollis runs the timber operation in the valley. He is a patient man and a methodical one. I believe he has decided that if he cannot buy what he wants, he will lower its value until he can. He is not trying to acquire land. He is trying to demonstrate that a woman alone cannot hold it. Harriet closed the notebook. Frank Hollis, son of Harold Hollis, 2 generations, same strategy, same patience, same fundamental belief that a woman on her own on this mountain was a temporary condition. She looked around the cabin, at the notebooks in the chest, at the diagrams and the pressed willow samples, and the careful 30-year record of a woman working alone on a problem that mattered. Alma Reese had stolen 2 letters in 40 years. Harold Hollis had started a campaign of isolation that had never fully let up. And yet Maggie had stayed, had kept working, had built and rebuilt and documented everything as if she knew that understanding didn't require an audience. It only required a record in time and eventually the right person to find it. Harriet sat down at the table with the notebook stacked in front of her. The wind was picking up outside. She could hear it finding the gaps in the chinking, could feel the cold it carried pushing into the room. She opened notebook 1 again to the very first entry, and she read the words Maggie had written on the 3rd day of October, 1885, the year she'd arrived on this mountain. The men at the recorder's office thought it was amusing. 3 families had abandoned the property before me. I intend to be the last person who has to start over here. Harriet read that line twice. Then she closed the notebook and put her hand flat on the cover and sat for a while with the sound of the wind and the creak of the stove and the smell of cedar and old paper around her. She was 68 years old. She had $23 in a suitcase and a broken coat collar and a pair of hands that ached in the cold every morning since she turned 60. She was also, it turned out, the granddaughter of a woman who had spent 30 years building something in the mountains that no one else believed in, who had written letters into silence and kept working anyway, who had known she might not live to meet the person she was building it for and had built it anyway. The willows along the creek bent in the wind outside. They didn't break. They had been bending in this wind for 30 years of Maggie's cultivation, and longer before that, and they were still there bare in October gray and leafless, looking like they had nothing left to offer, and still there, still rooted. Harriet looked at the structures in the clearing through the cabin window, those strange curved shapes that everyone in Tucker County had called proof of madness. She looked at the notebooks. She looked at the brown paper package still sitting where she'd set it the night before, unopened, her name on it in her grandmother's careful hand. She thought about Frank Hollis and his patient smile and his father's strategy and the 2 generations of Hollis men who had believed with some confidence that this mountain would eventually surrender whatever was on it to whoever wanted it badly enough. She thought about Alma Reese sending back letters, about all the years that had passed while those letters sat in a file somewhere, returned uncollected, waiting. She thought about what it meant to be 68 years old with nowhere to go. And then she stopped thinking about all of that and thought instead about what Maggie had written in 1921 after Harold Hollis had started his quiet campaign. He is not trying to acquire land. He is trying to demonstrate that a woman alone cannot hold it. Harriet stood up. She put on her coat. She went outside into the cold October morning and stood in the clearing among the decaying wicker structures and the bare willows and looked at all of it, the collapsed experiments and the ones still standing, the failed attempts and the successful ones, 30 years of a woman refusing to be demonstrated upon. She reached out and pressed her hand against the willow arch over the garden. It was still solid, gray and weathered, but solid. The weave hadn't loosened. The anchors had held. Whatever Maggie had figured out about how to make something last, she had figured it out here in this arch, which had been standing without anyone to tend it for 2 years and was still standing. Harriet took her hand away and looked at the palm print she'd left in the frost on the wicker. Finish what I started. She went back inside and opened the package. The first week nearly finished her. Not the cold, though the cold was serious. Not the loneliness, though the loneliness was the kind that sits in the chest like something swallowed wrong. What nearly finished her was simpler than either of those things and more humiliating. She didn't know how to do anything. That was the truth of it, stripped of comfort. Harriet Voss had spent 40 years being competent. She had managed a household, kept accounts, nursed a sick husband, through 2 years of slow decline, fixed what broke and paid what was owed, and made do in the particular skilled way that women of her generation had been required to make do. She was not a woman who failed at things she put her mind to, but she had put her mind to this mountain, and this mountain was not impressed. The first morning she's tried to gather firewood, she miscalculated the weight of a fallen branch and wrenched her left shoulder, pulling it free. The pain was bright and immediate, and it stayed a dull reminder every time she reached above her head for the next 2 weeks. The second morning, she tried to reset a section of chinking on the north wall using the technique described in Maggie's notebook, creek mud packed with dried grass, and found that creek mud in October was not the same material as creek mud in September, that it froze before it could bond, that she'd have to find a different approach or accept the cold that came through that wall every night. The third morning, she went looking for food. Maggie's notebooks were precise about what could be eaten on this land and how to prepare it. Acorns from the oak stand to the east of the cabin, soaked for 3 days to remove the bitterness. The inner bark of young willows stripped and boiled until soft enough to chew. Not good, but nutritious, the notebook said, in the way of things that keep you alive without making you glad to be alive. Rabbit caught in snares built from willow bark cordage, the diagrams for which were on page 47 of Notebook 3. Harriet studied page 47 for a long time before going out to try it. The snares she built that first week would not have caught anything. She could see that in retrospect. The proportions were wrong, too large, the trigger mechanism too stiff, the placement too obvious. The rabbits, if they noticed them at all, were politely unimpressed. She ate willow bark broth and handfuls of frozen acorns she hadn't soaked long enough, and she went to bed hungry and woke up hungry and worked hungry through short days that turned dark by 4:30 and left her sitting by the stove reading Maggie's notebooks by candlelight. She lost weight she didn't have to lose. Her hands cracked in the cold, and the cracks bled a little each morning when she flexed her fingers. Her knees, which had been giving her trouble since her early 60s, grew stiff by mid-afternoon and ached through the night. On the 6th day, she sat at the table and thought seriously about leaving. She had thought about it before the thought moved through her mind several times a day, more honest than she wanted it to be. Pittsburgh was gone. But there were other cities, Baltimore, Columbus, places where a woman her age could find a room to rent and perhaps some kind of work cleaning, mending the kinds of things her hands knew without being told. It would be a diminished life, a life lived inside other people's needs. But it would be warm, and there would be food on a predictable schedule, and she would not wake up every morning to the specific arithmetic of how many days she could survive on what she had left. She sat at the table with the notebooks in front of her and looked out the window at the wicker structures in the clearing and thought about Frank Hollis's smile and Amarissa's filing cabinet and all the mechanisms by which the world had arranged to make her feel that whatever she reached for was slightly beyond where she could reach. She was 68 years old and her shoulder hurt, and she was hungry. Then she opened Notebook 3 to a page she hadn't read yet. November 3rd, 1887. The worst part is the third week. The mind begins to negotiate with itself in ways that feel like reason, but are not reason. It says you have proven your point. It says no one is watching, so no one will know if you go. It says you can always come back when conditions are better, which is a lie the mind tells when it has run out of better lies. I looked at the willows this morning. They have been through 6 winters on this ridge now, the ones I planted the first year. They are not comfortable. They are not thriving in any way I would choose for myself. But they are still there. And when spring comes, they will grow again because that is what they do. They endure the winter, not by being immune to it, but by being built for bending. If they can stay, I can stay. Harriet read the entry twice. Then she closed the notebook and went outside and cut willow branches until her shoulder screamed at her to stop. And then she cut a few more, and then she went inside and built up the fire and studied page 47 again with more attention than she'd given it the first time. The snares she built the following morning were better. On the 9th day, she caught her first rabbit. Clem Pruitt appeared on a Tuesday 3 weeks after Harriet arrived on the mountain. She was working at the edge of the clearing, trying to understand why the first art she'd built kept settling to the left when she became aware of being watched. She turned and found a man at the tree line, older than her by a few years at least. 74 or 75, tall in the way of men who were once very tall and have compressed slightly with age. A canvas coat, a felt hat, a face that had been left out in the weather for a long time and had developed the particular quality of weathered wood, harder and more interesting than it would have been otherwise. He was leaning on a hickory walking stick and looking at her arch with an expression she couldn't immediately read. She waited. He said, "You've got the base angle wrong." Not hello, not I'm your neighbor or I knew your grandmother. Just you've got the base angle wrong. She said, "I know. I can't figure out why it keeps settling left." He walked over, looked at the foundation, crouched down, which clearly cost him something in his knees, and pressed his fingers into the soil around the base of the left anchor. "Frost pocket," he said. Ground here is frozen 2 inches down but soft underneath. The anchor's sitting on ice, not earth. When the ice shifts, the anchor shifts. He stood back up. Maggie had the same problem the first winter. She solved it by going down past the frost line to the rock layer. He pointed. It's about 14 inches down here on this side, 16 on the other. He said it all in the tone of a man reporting weather conditions. Factual, impersonal, as if the information itself were the point and the emotional texture of it were someone else's business. She said, "You knew my grandmother." He said, "I knew her 30 years. His eyes, which were the pale gray of winter sky, moved from the anchor point to the clearing and then back. Played checkers on that porch every week when the weather allowed. She talked about her work, and I asked questions, and she answered them, and then I went home and she kept working. That was how it was." He said it without apparent sentiment. But there was something in the economy of it, in what he was not saying, that Harriet recognized. She had been married long enough to know the difference between a man who has nothing to say and a man who has too much. His name was Clem Pruitt. He did stonework foundations mostly, and some masonry. He lived 2 miles down the mountain in a stone house he had built himself 40 years ago. He had been watching her work for 10 days before he came over. She asked him why he had waited. He said, "I wanted to see what you do with the notebooks." She looked at him. He looked at the arch. She said, what was she like? Not as a builder, as a person. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said she was the most stubborn person I ever knew, man or woman. She had a way of looking at a problem that was completely her own. She'd walk around it, look at it from 6 different angles, read everything ever written about it, and then she'd set all of that aside and figure it out from the ground up as if no one had ever thought about it before. Sometimes that made her slow. Sometimes it meant she found things everyone else had walked past. He paused. The mountain suited her, he said. Some people and some places fit each other. She and this ridge fit each other. Harriet thought about that. Then she said, there's something I need to tell you. She told him what she'd found in the notebooks, the entry about Harold Hollis, the campaign of isolation, the deliberate effort to lower the property's value and reputation. And she told him that Frank Hollis had been here on the second day with an offer and a smile, and that particular quality of patience that spoke of a man who was used to waiting for the thing he wanted to fall toward him. Clem listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, Frank Hollis has been trying to acquire this ridge for 15 years. He's got a timber contract with a company out of Morgantown that needs the hardwood. He has been patient because he has been certain. He has been certain because he knew Maggie was old and alone, and that eventually the land would become available. He looked at Harriet. You are not what he was planning for, he said. She said, no, I don't suppose I am. Then he told her about the anchor points, and she got her shovel, and they dug down through the frozen topsoil to the rock layer, and she reset the base, and by the end of the afternoon, the arch was straight. He left at dusk. He didn't say he'd be back, but he came the next day and the day after that. He did not do the work for her. That was the thing she came to understand about Clem Pruitt in those early weeks. He was constitutionally incapable of simply taking over. He would watch. He would ask a question that pointed her toward the answer without providing it. Occasionally, he would demonstrate a technique and then step back and let her practice it until she had it or didn't. But the decisions were hers and the labor was hers, and when she made a mistake, he said so without apology and then waited for her to figure out the correction. She asked him once if he'd been a teacher. He said no. But I worked with Maggie for 30 years, and she couldn't abide being helped. She'd accept information. She'd accept a second opinion. But the moment you tried to take something out of her hands, she'd stop the whole conversation and look at you until you remembered yourself. He said it as if it were a personality defect he had found entirely reasonable. Harriet began to understand what the notebooks had not fully conveyed, the tactile physical knowledge of working with willow. Maggie had described it precisely and illustrated it carefully, but paper could not transmit the feel of a branch at the edge of its flexibility, the particular resistance that meant bend further, and the subtly different resistance that meant stop or it breaks. Paper could not tell you how long to soak the thicker branches before they became workable, or how the quality of the wood changed with the temperature of the water, or how to feel in your hands the difference between a weave that would hold and one that looked like it would hold but wouldn't. She learned these things the way Maggie had learned them, by getting them wrong and paying attention to the failure. The willows along the creek were Maggie's cultivation, 30 years of selective planting and harvesting that had produced something between a grove and a workshop. Every variety had a purpose in the notebooks: the long whips for fine weaving, the medium-gauge branches for the body of a structure, the thicker trunks bent while still green for the load-bearing arches that would give the passage its shape. Harriet learned them the way you learn a language, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence, then with something approaching fluency. She built a small windbreak first. 6 feet of woven willow behind the cabin, curved to deflect the prevailing wind away from the north-facing wall. It took her 4 days, and it wasn't pretty. The weave was uneven in places, and one of the anchor posts leaned slightly. But when she stood behind it on the 5th day and felt the air go still while the wind moved around it rather than through it, something shifted in her understanding. Not a thought, a feeling. The feeling of a principle becoming real. This was what Maggie had been trying to tell people for 30 years. You could build against the wind and the wind would win. Or you could learn the shape of the wind and build with it, and then the wind became part of the structure. The thing that everyone said would destroy you became the thing that held you up. Harriet stood behind that small windbreak in the November cold and felt the still air around her and understood why Maggie had kept going for 30 years without an audience. Because this was real. Because it worked. Because the alternative was letting people freeze in their beds. Because nobody would listen to a woman who had figured out how to stop it. She went down to town the second week of November. The general store in Parsons was a low-framed building on the main street with a hand-painted sign and a porch where 2 men in coveralls sat on chairs, despite the cold, watching the street, with the patient, proprietary attention of men who have watched this particular street for a long time. Inside, Clarence Dodd stood behind the counter. He was a big man, not fat but wide, with the florid complexion of someone who spends a great deal of time being certain about things. He looked at Harriet the way people look at things they have already decided about. She gave him her list: lamp oil, cornmeal, a coil of wire, 2 lengths of rope. He took the list and looked it over and named a price that was not a fair price. She knew it wasn't fair. He knew she knew. There was a silence in which this understanding existed between them without being spoken. She paid it. She had $11 left. As he wrapped the cornmeal in paper, without looking up, he said, "Heard you're up at the Voss place." She said, "That's right." He said, "Heard you've been building." He said the word the way people say a word when they mean something unflattering by it. His eyes moved to the 2 men who had come in from the porch to stand near the back of the store. Someone near the window said something too low to hear clearly, and there was a sound that was almost a laugh. "Frozen solid by February," Dodd said. He said it pleasantly, conversationally, the way you'd mention the weather. "Just my opinion. But the Mountain Inn doesn't make exceptions for good intentions." Harriet picked up her bag. She looked at Dodd for a moment, at his red face and his certain eyes, and the 2 men by the back wall with their almost laughs, and she thought about Maggie writing in 1921, about Harold Hollis, about how he'd used the town's willingness to dismiss her as a tool, how he'd fed it and shaped it and let it do his work for him. She thought about all the years that strategy had worked. She said, "My grandmother survived 30 winters on that ridge. She only died because her roof collapsed." She paused. "The same kind of roof you have over this store." She picked up her bag and walked out. She heard the silence behind her as she went through the door. She did not hear what was said after she was gone. She didn't need to. The first collapse came on the 22nd of November. She had been building the windbreak section behind the woodshed, a more ambitious structure than the first, taller with a compound curve she had worked out from Maggie's notebook, 7, the one that covered 1909 through 1915. The weave had taken 10 days. She had been careful with the anchors going down past the frost line the way Clem had shown her. She thought it was good. The storm came up fast in the afternoon, the way storms do on exposed ridges, with very little warning between the clouds appearing and the wind arriving at serious speed. By evening, the gusts were hard enough to push her sideways when she walked. She went inside and listened to the cabin walls flex and creak and thought, hold. Just hold. In the morning, she went out and found the windbreak in pieces. Not damaged, not partially standing. In pieces. The anchors had held, but the weave had separated at the upper connections, the place where the curved section met the vertical, and once that joint had failed, the whole structure had no resistance to the wind's lateral force, and it had simply come apart. She stood in the wreckage for a long time. The cold was serious. Her breath made clouds in the still air that followed the storm. Branches lay across the clearing like scattered kindling. All that work reduced to its components every hour she'd spent reversed in a single night. She thought about Frank Hollis, about what he would say if he drove up this mountain right now and saw this, about the smile that would go nowhere near his eyes. She thought about Dodd's frozen solid by February. She thought about the woman whose notebook was hidden behind the cabin wall, the one who had been here before Maggie, who had also tried, who had written at the end, "I didn't have enough courage to stay." Then she went inside and opened Notebook 9. November 14th, 1913. The eastern section collapsed last night. Fourth time. The failure is always at the same point, the connection between the curved upper section and the vertical anchor. The weave pulls apart there because the two sections move differently in high wind. The curve wants to flex. The vertical wants to hold. Where they meet, the forces are opposite, and the joint is the weakest point. The solution is not to make the joint stronger. The solution is to eliminate the joint, to make the curve continuous from anchor to anchor, so there is no point where two different structural logics meet. I should have seen this sooner. I am starting over tomorrow. Harriet read it twice. Then she read the next entry and the one after that, following Maggie's logic through the revision. The way she'd redesigned the connection made it continuous, changed the anchor spacing, so the curve could complete itself without interruption. She put the notebook down. She went out into the cold and began gathering the scattered branches. It took 3 days to sort and bundle what was salvageable. On the fourth day, she began again with a continuous curve with the revised anchor spacing, with the understanding she had not had before. Clem came on the fifth day, saw what she was doing, asked one question, the spacing on the third anchor, and when she explained her reasoning, he nodded once and didn't ask again. She built. She made mistakes and corrected them. She soaked branches too long and not long enough and learned the difference in her hands. She set anchors she had to pull and reset. She burned herself bending thicker branches over the stove and added the scars to the collection her hands were accumulating. By the first week of December, the windbreak was rebuilt. The second storm came 3 days later. She lay in the cabin in the dark and listened to the wind and waited for the sound of the structure coming apart. It didn't come. In the morning, the windbreak was standing. Snow had packed around the base exactly as Maggie described, not crushing the structure but integrating with it, becoming part of it. The curved surface had shed what it could and used what remained. Inside the sheltered space behind the structure, the air was still. Harriet stood there for a long time. She was not the kind of woman given to displays of feeling. She had learned early that feeling something and showing it were separate decisions, and she had learned to keep them separate because the world had not always been gentle with the things she let show. But she stood in that still air on that December morning and pressed her palm against the woven willow wall, and she said out loud to no one who was physically present, "It works, Maggie. You were right." The willow didn't answer, but the wind moved around the outside of the structure in exactly the way Maggie had described in Notebook 7, and the air inside stayed still, and Harriet thought that was answer enough. Then came the other thing, the thing Clem told her on a cold afternoon in the second week of December, when they were sitting in the cabin warming their hands after a long morning of work. He had been talking about Maggie about a particular winter in the mid-30s, when the snow had come early and deep and the county had lost 3 barns and a number of livestock. About how Maggie had gone down to town that spring and stood in the feed store and told anyone who would listen that she had a design that would have saved every one of those structures, and about how no one had listened, and about how she had walked home and written 4 pages in her notebook and the next day started building a better version. Then he said she finished the passage, you know. Harriet looked up. The willow tunnel between the cabin and the woodshed. The design she'd been working on the longest. She finished it in 1947. Harriet waited. Clem looked at his hands. He said the winter of 1948 was bad. February especially. I was down the mountain. My sister was sick in Elkins, and I'd gone to help. I was gone 3 weeks. He was quiet for a moment. When I came back, he said I went up to see Maggie. The passage it was remarkable. Everything she'd designed it to be. The snow hadn't touched the inside. The structure had held perfectly through the worst of the winter. He stopped. She had been dead for 2 weeks, he said, alone in the cabin. Her heart. The passage had worked exactly as she'd intended, but there was no one there to use it because there was no one else on the mountain, and the people in town had stopped coming up years before and I was gone. Harriet didn't say anything. He said, Harold Hollis spent 20 years making sure she was isolated enough that when something went wrong, there was no one close enough to know. That was the real purpose of the campaign. Not the land. He could have gotten the land any number of ways. He wanted to make sure that whatever she built up here, it built for nobody. He looked at Harriet. Frank has been doing the same thing to you. Not just the price and the rumors. The reason he moved on the town so fast on Dodd on the others was to make sure that when winter came, you'd have no one to call on. He wants the passage to fail the same way it failed before. Not by falling down, by being built for nobody. Harriet sat with that. Outside, the wind moved through the willows along the creek, that same sound she had learned to read over the past 2 months. The difference between the ordinary wind and the leading edge of something larger. She thought about Maggie in this cabin in February of 1948, the passage complete outside the window working perfectly. No one coming, no one knowing. She thought about the woman in the hidden notebook. I didn't have enough courage to stay. She thought about the archive Maggie had left in the cedar chest. 17 notebooks. Every failure documented. Every correction noted. Every hard-won piece of understanding preserved with the precision of someone who knew she might not be there to explain it in person. Maggie had not built the passage for herself. She had built it for whoever came next in a world where the people trying to isolate her had succeeded well enough that whoever came next might not arrive until after she was gone. Harriet looked at Clem. She said, I'm going to build the passage, the full design, cabin to woodshed, and when it's done, I'm going to teach every family in this valley how to build one. Clem looked at her for a moment. He said, you've got maybe 3 weeks before the serious weather. She said, I know. He said, the full passage is a bigger undertaking than anything you've built so far. She said, I know that too. He nodded, once. The way he nodded when he'd asked a question and received an answer he considered adequate. He said, I'll show you how to set the stone footings. The rest is in the notebooks. She built it in 17 days. Not the way it should have been built if she'd had the time Maggie had taken. Not with properly cured willow and 3 months of careful work. She built it the way you build things when the weather is coming and you have 17 days and a 68-year-old body that ached before 8 in the morning and didn't stop aching until she was asleep. The stone footings first. 6 of them set below the frost line packed with creek gravel for drainage. Clem showed her the placement and then left her to dig, which was the hardest physical labor she had ever done. Down through frozen topsoil to the rock layer, 2 feet in most places, closer to 3 on the north side. She broke 2 tools and learned to wedge rather than pry. Her hands stopped being sore and became simply her hands calloused, cracked precise. Then the arches. She didn't have enough proper trunk-size willow, so she did what Maggie had described trying, and then abandoning in Notebook 11, bundled smaller branches and wrapped them with bark cordage until they had the composite strength of a larger trunk. It was slower than using solid wood. It worked. The bending. She soaked the arches in the creek for days, then heated them by the stove until the wood was willing, then bent them to the curve and lashed them to the footings before they remembered their original shape. She burned herself. She lost count of the burns. The weaving took 10 days, working from first light until her hands were too stiff to grip. Inside to warm up, then back out. The pattern from Notebook 7 modified at the base where she'd learned from the collapsed windbreak that the continuous curve was stronger than any joint. On the 15th of December, she wove the last branch into place. She stood back and looked at what she'd built. 23 feet of woven willow arching between the cabin's back door and the woodshed. 4 feet wide at the base, 5 feet tall at the peak. A tunnel, a bridge between buildings. A way to move through winter rather than surrender to it. It didn't look like much from the outside. It looked like what it was, something built by one old woman in 17 days with inadequate materials and insufficient time held together by the logic of a dead woman's notebooks and a stubbornness that had outlasted every other resource she'd arrived with. She went inside. The cold stopped at the entrance. Not gradually, immediately. She stepped through and the wind was simply pouring and the air inside was still and 10 degrees warmer than outside and smelled of cut willow and the particular dry quiet of enclosed space. She walked the full length of it, 23 feet, to the woodshed door, filled her arms with wood, walked back. Her hands stayed warm. Her feet stayed dry. She stood in the center of the passage with firewood piled to her chin, and she laughed. The sound surprised her. She hadn't heard herself laugh and she couldn't remember. Long enough that the sound felt strange, like a word in a language she'd known as a child and half forgotten. But she couldn't stop. She laughed until her eyes watered and the sound bounced off the wicker walls and the firewood shifted in her arms, and she had to set it down to keep her balance. Then she got quiet. She pressed her palm against the woven wall. The willow was cold to the touch, but solid, completely solid, and she could feel through her hand what Maggie had figured out in 30 years of building and failing and building again. She could feel the way the structure transferred force, the way the curve distributed load, the way the whole thing worked with the mountain rather than against it. She said quietly to the woman who had built the first version of this and died before anyone came to use it, "You built it for me." The wind moved outside. The passage held. She picked up. Clem felt it 2 days before it came. He arrived at the cabin on the morning of January 6th without his usual unhurried manner. He walked faster than she had seen him walk. His face had a quality she hadn't seen on it before. Not fear exactly, but the close relative of fear that belongs to people who have lived long enough to know the difference between weather and something else entirely. He said, "Something big is coming." She was at the table with notebook 14, the one that covered the winters of the late 30s. She looked up. He said, "I can feel it in the way the air is sitting, like it's waiting for permission." He looked out the window toward the ridge. "I've felt this maybe 3 times in my life. The last time was 1936. We lost 4 barns and 2 men that winter. Before that, 1917. He paused. "Before that, I was too young to know what I was feeling." Harriet set the notebook down. "How long?" she said. 2 days, maybe less." She went outside and looked at the sky. It was the color of old pewter, low in uniform without the texture of ordinary cloud cover. The kind of sky that doesn't move because it has already arrived. The birds were gone, not migrated, but absent in the particular way that meant they had found somewhere deep and protected and had no intention of coming out. The creek had gone quiet under its ice in a way that felt less like stillness and more like held breath. The air was cold in the specific way Maggie had described in Notebook 6, dense, pressurized, as if the atmosphere itself was being compressed by something moving toward it from a very great distance. She went back inside and looked at her woodpile. She looked at her food stores. She looked at her lamp oil and her matches and the wool blankets in the cedar chest. Then she put on her coat and went out to the passage and walked its length 3 times, pressing her hands against the wicker walls, testing the anchors at the base, checking the weave at the peak where the load would concentrate when the snow came. Everything held. Everything was solid. She went back inside and began to prepare. The storm arrived at 3 in the afternoon on January 8th, 1953. It did not build. It did not announce itself gradually the way ordinary storms give you time to adjust your understanding of what's coming. It came over the ridge like something that had made up its mind, a wall of wind and driving snow that turned the world outside the cabin window from visible to white in less time than it takes to describe. One moment she could see the passage, the woodshed, the willow grove along the creek. The next moment there was nothing but white absolute and total pressed against the glass like a living thing trying to get inside. The noise was unlike anything she had heard. She had lived through Pittsburgh winters, through lake-effect storms that came off the Ohio and buried the city for days. She had thought she knew what wind sounded like at its worst. She had been wrong. This was not wind the way she had understood wind. This was something structural, the sound with weight and pressure behind it, a continuous roar that came from everywhere at once and settled into the walls and the floor and the base of her skull and stayed there, the cabin held. The walls flexed, and the stovepipe rattled, and the gaps in the chinking she hadn't managed to fully repair turned white with driven snow. But the cabin held. She fed the stove. She melted snow for water. She sat in the chair nearest the warmth and opened Notebook 15 and read by lamplight while the mountain tried to dismantle everything outside. She read about the blizzard of 1936. Maggie had been 51 years old. She had been on this ridge alone, as she always was by then, the isolation Harold Hollis had engineered, having done its slow and patient work. She had spent 3 days in the cabin while the snow climbed the walls and the wind made the structure groan. She had documented the storm with the same precise attention she brought to everything: wind direction, temperature estimates, snowfall accumulation, the sounds the cabin made under different types of loading. And then on the third day she had written this, I can hear something. To the south toward the Greenway Hollow. A sound that is not wind. I think it is a roof. I think someone's roof is gone. I cannot get out of this cabin. The snow against the north door is above the handle. If I got out, I could not get through the drifts to reach anyone in time to matter. This is the thing I cannot solve. I can build a structure that holds. I cannot make the people in the valley build the same structure. I can solve the engineering. I cannot solve the stubbornness of people who have decided before looking that what a woman alone on a mountain has figured out is not worth knowing. So I sit here and I listen, and I am helpless in the particular way of people who know what should have been done and watched it not get done. Harriet set the notebook down. She sat in the lamplight and listened to the wind and thought about Maggie sitting in the same chair 17 years ago, listening to a roof come down somewhere in the dark and being unable to do anything about it. Then sometime in the deep middle of the first night she heard it, a sound from the south, lower than the wind, heavier, a long structural groan followed by something that resolved after a long moment into the unmistakable sound of a roof surrendering to what it had been asked to carry. She sat very still. She could not get out. She had checked the doors an hour ago. The north door had 2 feet of snow packed against it. She could move it enough to see the white wall beyond. Nothing more. If someone was hurt, if someone's house had just opened itself to this storm, she could not reach them. She could not do anything except know. She picked up her notebook. She had started keeping her own, a habit she had arrived at without deciding to, simply finding one evening that she was writing down what she had learned and couldn't stop, and she wrote the time and what she had heard and what she could not do about it. Then she understood something she had not fully understood before. Maggie had written 17 notebooks not only because she was thorough. She had written them because writing was the only action available to a person who has figured something out and is surrounded by people who will not listen. Writing was how you stayed sane when the alternative was sitting in the dark listening to other people's roofs fall in and knowing you had the answer and knowing they wouldn't take it. She wrote until the lamp needed refilling. Then she refilled it and wrote some more. The storm ran 48 hours. On the morning of January 10th, she woke to silence. Not the muffled, pressurized quiet of snow still falling. True silence. The silence that comes when something enormous has finished and the world is taking a breath before deciding what comes next. She lay in the bed for a long moment and let the silence be real. Then she got up. The north door took 20 minutes of careful work to open, not forcing, which would have been useless, but patient, steady pressure, while she cleared what she could reach through the gap, handful by handful, until the door had enough room to swing. She squeezed through into cold so sharp it felt like walking into glass. The world had been transformed. 12 feet of snow in the clearing. Drifts at 20 along the north face of the cabin, shaped by the wind into formations that looked architectural, curved deliberate, as if the storm had been making its own argument about structure. The trees at the edge of the clearing were buried to their lower branches. The road didn't exist. The valley below was a smooth white plain where the landscape used to be. She could see roof lines from the high ground near the woodshed. Some intact, some with that particular sunken quality that meant the structure beneath had given way. Dark concavities in the white where a home used to have a shape. She turned and looked at the passage. It rose from the snow in a long, clean arc, its entrance clear. Its surface carrying a thick shell of packed ice that had formed from the snow loading and refreezing overnight. She walked to it and pressed her hand against the iced-over wicker. Solid, she went inside. 38 degrees. Dry. Still. Outside, it was 14 below zero and dropping. She walked to the woodshed, filled her arms with wood, walked back. Her feet stayed dry. Her hands stayed warm. The wind, which was still moving outside in the storm's aftermath, could not find her. She stood in the center of the passage and looked at the wicker walls and thought about the 48 hours just passed and about all the roof lines she had seen from the high ground, the ones that were no longer the right shape. Then she went inside and started making soup. Vera Calloway came first. Harriet saw her from the window, a dark shape against the white moving up the mountain, with the particular gait of someone who has been through something and is not entirely sure their legs still work properly. She was moving slowly, falling and getting up. The snow was chest-high in the drifts, and she was pushing through it rather than around it, which meant she was beyond the point of making tactical decisions. It took her an hour to cover what would normally be a 10-minute walk. By the time she reached the clearing's edge, her lips were the color of a bruise. Her coat, good enough for a normal winter, not enough for this one, was packed with snow that had compressed and frozen against the wool. She had a child on her back, bundled in a quilt, the child's face the only thing visible, pale and frightened. Vera Calloway, who had called her witch's kin the first week she'd been on this mountain, who had stood in the feed store and said things in a voice not quite low enough to be private, who had looked at Harriet the way people look at things they have decided are beneath them. She stood at the edge of the clearing, unable to come further. Her eyes had the particular quality of someone who has exhausted everything they had and has arrived at a place past pride and past pretense, a place where there is nothing left but the actual situation. She said, "I know what I've said about you. I know what I've called your family. My children." She stopped. Her voice had the texture of something that had been used past its limit. She said, "Please." Just the one word. Harriet opened the door wider. She said, "Come inside. Bring your children." Vera Calloway started crying, not quietly. The way people cry when they have been holding themselves together through something they weren't sure they would survive, and they have finally arrived somewhere that might be safe, and their body decides unilaterally that now is the moment to let go. She grabbed Harriet's hand and pressed it against her frozen face and said "thank you" over and over until the words stopped being words and became something more like breath. Harriet said, "Go get your family. The fire will be built up when you come back." They came in ones and twos through the morning. The Calloway family, Vera, her daughter, her son-in-law, 2 grandchildren, a family from the lower valley. Harriet didn't recognize the Suttons, it turned out, who had lost their roof on the second night and spent 10 hours in their cellar listening to the storm claim their house above them. An old man who gave his name as Birch and nothing else, who had walked 2 miles through the drifts alone and arrived without explanation and sat by the stove without speaking, and gradually over several hours returned to a color that was closer to living. By afternoon, there were 11 people in the cabin. Harriet moved. She fed the stove. She stretched the soup, thin stuff, wild onion, and the last of the dried rabbit, more water than substance, but warm to cover however many bowls were needed. She spread blankets. She showed people the passage, watched their faces go through the same sequence. Hers had skepticism, confusion, then something quieter and more serious when they stepped inside and felt the air go still. "It's warm," one of the Sutton children said. She was maybe 7 years old. She looked at the wicker walls with the frank astonishment of someone who has not yet learned to hide being amazed. "How is it warm?" Harriet said, "Your grandmother's house has a roof to keep the rain out. This has a curve to keep the wind out." Same idea, different shape. The child thought about this. Then she nodded with the gravity of someone filing information away. Harriet went back to the stove. She thought about Maggie in 1936, sitting in the same cabin listening to a roof come down somewhere in the dark, helpless, unable to reach anyone. She thought about the 17 notebooks, about all the years of building and failing and building, and the deliberate isolation that had made sure none of it reached the people it was built for. The fire didn't know who had mocked her. The passage didn't know who had called her grandmother a witch. The soup didn't know who had laughed in a lawyer's office in Pittsburgh 3 months ago. She ladled soup into bowls and handed them to people who had called her names she hadn't earned, and she did it without the feeling she had expected to feel, which was some version of triumph. What she felt instead was simpler and less satisfying and more true. She felt like a person doing what needed doing because she was the person present who knew how to do it. That was all. It was enough. Clarence Dodd came on the second day. His store had lost 2 windows to the wind, and a section of the rear wall had buckled under the snow load. His wife had been in the back room when it happened, and the cold had gotten into her chest during the hours before they could get the gap covered. He arrived alone, his wife following 20 minutes behind in the wagon. His son-in-law drove the woman wrapped in every blanket they owned, coughing with the particular deep sound that means the cold has found somewhere it intends to stay. Dodd stood at the door and looked at Harriet and said nothing for a long moment. She had a clear memory of him behind his counter. Frozen solid by February, said pleasantly, publicly, with the easy confidence of a man who has never been wrong about things he hasn't thought carefully about. He looked at her and he didn't say anything, and she could see the effort that cost him, not the silence itself, which seemed to come naturally. But whatever was behind the silence, the thing he was not saying and was not going to say. She said, "Bring her in by the stove." He brought his wife in. He sat beside her and held her hand and looked at the floor. After an hour, the woman's color began to improve. Her coughing eased. She fell asleep in the chair, with her husband's hand still in hers. Dodd sat with her until evening. When he left, he said nothing to Harriet. He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, and stood there for a moment with his back to the room. Then he left. The following morning, before she was up, she found a canvas bag on the porch, lamp oil, cornmeal, salt, a coil of new rope, no note, no name on it. She stood in the doorway holding the bag and looked down the mountain toward where the road had been. She understood. Some people do not have the language for "I was wrong." They have never learned the words, and by the time they understand they need them, it is too late to learn from scratch. But they have other languages. They have the language of a bag left on a porch before dawn. They have the language of a hand held a door, fixed a thing done without being asked. She took the bag inside. She didn't mention it to anyone. Frank Hollis came on the third day. She saw him from the window, a figure picking his way up the mountain through snow that was still thigh-deep in the open sections, moving with the careful, effortful gait of a man who owns very good boots and is discovering for the first time that boots have their limits. His coat, the expensive one, the one that had looked so precisely calibrated when he wore it in October, was no longer calibrated. It was functional barely and not much more. He reached the clearing and stopped. He looked at the passage for a long moment. Then he looked at the cabin, at the smoke from the chimney, at the tracks in the snow from 11 people moving in and out over 2 days. He had the look of a man who has arrived at the end of a calculation he was certain would come out differently. She opened the door before he knocked. He stood on the porch, and she could see the effort it took him to look at her directly. Not shame. Exactly, she didn't think Frank Hollis had the architecture for shame, but something in the neighborhood of it. The specific discomfort of a man who has built his understanding of a situation on a set of assumptions and has watched the situation decline to cooperate. He said, "2 of my crew didn't make it. The logging camp on the upper ridge. The main structure collapsed on the first night." She said nothing. He said, "The others have frostbite. I have a man whose hands," he stopped. "A man whose hands I'm not sure about." She looked at him. She thought about Harold Hollis feeding rumors to a town for 20 years, about letters returned unopened, about the winter Maggie had finished the passage and died alone because the isolation had been so thorough and so long that there was no one left to notice. She thought about 2 men on a ridge who would not be coming down. She said the woodshed has medical supplies. Bandages, carbolic, the oil from the lamp for the frostbite. "Take what your men need." He opened his mouth. He closed it. He stood there in the cold with his expensive ruined coat and his recalculated face, and whatever he had prepared to say, whatever version of this conversation he had scripted on the way up the mountain, it had apparently not included this particular response, and he didn't have an alternative ready. He said, "I'll pay you for the supplies." She said, "I don't need your money. I need you to take what keeps people alive." He took the supplies. He came back twice that day, and once the following morning for additional bandages. Each time Harriet got what he needed from the woodshed and handed it to him without ceremony and went back to whatever she was doing. On the 4th morning, he didn't come back. She heard later from Vera Calloway's son-in-law that Frank Hollis had driven to Elkins and from there to Morgantown, and that his timber operation in Tucker County had quietly ceased. The logging contract that had required the ridge hardwood had apparently been rendered impractical by a combination of storm damage and the particular complications of continuing to do business in a place where you have recently watched your assumptions fail in every direction simultaneously. He did not return to Tucker County. Harriet did not miss him. She found the letter on the 5th day. The cabin had mostly emptied by then, people returning to their own properties, beginning the long work of assessing damage, figuring out what was salvageable and what wasn't. Harriet was reorganizing the cedar chest, putting Maggie's notebooks back in order after days of being moved around by people looking for something to read by firelight. She lifted the cedar chest's interior lining to lay a piece of oilcloth beneath it, protection against the moisture that seeped through the cabin floor in the deep cold, and found pressed flat against the bottom of the chest beneath the lining an envelope. Small, unsealed. The paper was the same stock as Maggie's notebooks, the same hand on the front. It said, For Harriet, when you find this, not if, when. She sat down on the floor of the cabin with the letter in her hands. Outside, the January afternoon was already going dark. The fire in the stove threw orange light across the floor. The passage was visible through the window, its wicker surface catching the last of the day's light, solid and curved and present. She opened the envelope. The letter was dated September 1947, 6 months before Maggie died. Harriet, it began, I have finished the passage. It took me 30 years and more failures than I want to count, but it is done and it works, and it is everything I believed it could be. I walked through it this morning in a frost that would have had me running for firewood before, and I felt nothing but still air and the smell of willow and the particular satisfaction of a problem that has been solved. I want to tell you about it. I have wanted to tell you about it since you were born, since I knew you existed and couldn't reach you. I wrote twice and the letters came back, and I understood what that meant, that someone had decided for you that you didn't need what I had to offer. I am sorry I wasn't strong enough to push past that. I should have come to Pittsburgh myself. I should have stood on the steps of that gray building and refused to leave until they let me see you. I was 70 then, and I told myself I was too old for that kind of fight. I was wrong. There is no age at which you are too old to fight for the people you love. I know that now, and I cannot undo the knowing. But here is what I can do. I have built the passage. I have documented everything in the notebooks, every failure, every correction, everything I learned from getting it wrong. I have made the chest as weatherproof as I can manage. I have placed this letter where you will find it when you need it, which I believe will be after the first real storm, because that is when people look for what they need most carefully. I do not know when you will come. I do not know if you will come in my lifetime. I am 92 years old and the winters are longer than they used to be, and I am honest enough with myself to know that the arithmetic is not in my favor. But I know you will come eventually, because the land is yours and the land is worth coming for, even if no one has told you that yet. When you come, you will find what I built. And when you read this, I want you to know something that I was not able to tell you any other way. I have been building for you since before you knew you existed. Every structure in that clearing, every failure and revision in those notebooks, every winter I stayed on this ridge, when the sensible thing would have been to go somewhere warmer and easier, all of it was practice. Practice for the thing I wanted to leave you. Not the passage, not the notebooks, the knowledge that you come from a woman who did not stop. Whatever they have told you about this land, whatever they have told you about yourself, they were measuring the wrong things. The willows know this. The willows have been bending in this wind for 30 years of my tending, and longer before that, and they do not stop because the wind is strong. They stop for nothing. Neither should you. Your grandmother, who loved you before she knew you and knows you now and is proud. Margaret. Harriet sat on the floor of the cabin for a long time. The fire crackled. The passage was dark through the window now, just a shape against the snow. But she knew exactly what it was and exactly how it was built and exactly what it had cost the woman who built it. She was not a woman given to crying in front of people. There was no one there. She cried until the lamp needed refilling. Then she refilled it and sat quietly for a while longer. And eventually she got up and put another piece of wood in the stove and went to the window and looked out at the passage in the dark. 30 years. Maggie had spent 30 years building something for a granddaughter she would never meet, and she had documented every step of it, and she had arranged for it to be found, and it had been found, and it had held. It had held. The spring came slowly to Backbone Mountain, the way spring comes to high ground, reluctantly in fits and starts, a warm day, followed by a cold week, followed by something that couldn't decide what it was. But it came. By March, the willows along the creek were showing the first pale green of new growth, that particular color that means the winter is not over, but has lost its absolute authority. By April 3, families from the valley had come up the mountain to ask Harriet about the passage, had asked her to walk them through the design to show them the anchor placement, to explain the weave pattern and why the curve mattered. She showed them. She showed them the way Maggie had shown no one, because no one would stand still long enough to watch. She walked them through the logic, the wind, the snow load, the difference between building against the mountain and building with it. She showed them the notebooks. She let them hold them, read the entries, follow the 30-year arc of a woman getting closer and closer to a solution. She watched their faces change. Clem came on an April afternoon and found her in the clearing with the family from the Greenway Hollow, showing the oldest son how to test a willow branch for the right stage of flexibility. He sat on the porch steps and watched without comment until the lesson was done. When the family left, Harriet came and sat beside him. He said Maggie would be proud. She looked at the passage at the willows at the 47 acres that everyone had called worthless, and that had turned out to be worth more than she had language for. She said she knew you loved her, didn't she? He was quiet for a while. He said, I think she knew. He looked at the willow grove at the pale green coming in along the creek. I think she was grateful I never said it out loud. It would have made things complicated, and she didn't like complicated. She liked problems she could solve. He paused. She solved most of them, he said. Harriet put her hand on his arm, and they sat there in the April sun while the willows moved in a wind that was no longer trying to kill anything, and the mountains settled into the long, slow exhale of a winter finally finished. Alma Reese came in June. Harriet was in the garden, the one she'd built inside a wicker windbreak, extending the growing season by planting on the south-facing side of the curve, when she heard a car on the road below. She straightened up and waited. The woman who came through the trees was smaller than Harriet remembered, older in the way of people who have carried something heavy for a long time and show it in their frame. She was wearing a gray traveling dress and carrying a package wrapped in brown paper, and her hands, Harriet noticed, were not quite steady. She said Harriet. Just the name. No title, no formality. Harriet said Director Reese. The woman flinched slightly at the title. She said, I read about you in the papers. She paused. The passage. What you built. They wrote about your grandmother, too, about what she'd figured out. Harriet waited. Alma Reese held out the package. She said, this came for you in 1906. I told myself I was protecting you. That contact with an eccentric woman living alone in the mountains would give you false hope, would complicate your placement, would do you more harm than good. She stopped. I told myself a great many things over a great many years. She looked at Harriet. I was wrong about all of them, she said. I was wrong about her, and I was wrong about the land, and I was wrong to make a decision that wasn't mine to make. Harriet looked at the package. Her name on it. 1906, 47 years. She said, I've already found most of what she left me. The notebooks, the letters in the chest. Alma Reese nodded. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady, the voice of a woman who has rehearsed this and intends to get through it. She said, I know I can't give back what I took. I know there's no accounting for that. Harriet took the package from her hands. She said, I forgive you. She said it clearly without softening it into something smaller than it was. Not because you deserve it, because carrying the anger of it up this mountain every day costs more than I'm willing to spend. She said, come inside, there's coffee. Alma Reese stood very still for a moment, as if checking whether the ground was solid. Then she followed Harriet into the cabin. By 1958, there were 23 Wicker passages in Tucker County. By 1960, a professor from the engineering school at West Virginia University had published a paper cited in 3 subsequent journals that documented Maggie's design methodology with the precision it had always deserved, that named the structural principles she had discovered and traced their application through the variants Harriet had built and taught. The paper listed its primary source as the collected notebooks of Margaret Crane Voss donated to the University Archive by her granddaughter. The following year, the Tucker County Historical Society mounted a small bronze plaque on the exterior of the original passage, which was by then understood to be the first of its kind. It read, Margaret Crane Voss, 1855 to 1948, pioneer of adaptive winter shelter design. She built with the mountain. Harriet drove the first nail herself. She was 77 years old. Her hands were steadier than they'd been in her 60s, which she attributed to 4 years of working with willow. Her knees were worse. She didn't mention this to anyone. She stood back and looked at the plaque on the passage she had built in 17 days in the winter of 1952 with inadequate materials in a 68-year-old body and 17 notebooks written by a woman she never met. Clem stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He put his hand on the passage wall, the same gesture she had learned from watching him, the gesture of a man checking whether something is solid, and nodded once. After a while, he said she would have argued with the wording. She said, I know. She thought build with the mountain was imprecise. He said she thought everything was imprecise until it wasn't. Harriet smiled. The willows along the creek were in full summer growth, now dense and green, and moving in a wind that was warm for once that wasn't trying to do anything except move. 30 years of Maggie's cultivation still growing, still producing the branches that 3 generations of Tucker County families now knew how to work with, still bending in exactly the way they had always bent, not because the wind was gentle, but because bending was what they had been built for. She had arrived on this mountain with $23 in a suitcase and nowhere else to go. She had thought it might be the end of something. She had been wrong about that in the most complete way it is possible to be wrong. Not just a little wrong, not wrong about the details while being right about the shape, but entirely fundamentally wrong at the level of what a thing is. It had not been an ending. It had been a letter written in willow and stone and 30 years of refusal from a woman who loved her before she knew her name that said, "I knew you would come. I built this so you'd have somewhere to stand when you arrived." She had arrived. She had stood. And then she had built something of her own from the same materials, in the same tradition, for the same reason, so that whoever came next would have somewhere to stand too. That was all inheritance ever was, she understood now. Not land, not money, not the things you could put in a chest or a will or a file folder in a lawyer's office. It was the knowledge that someone before you had refused to stop, that they had failed and kept building, that they had been cold and hungry and dismissed and had kept building anyway, that they had built for you specifically with your name on it, addressed to you at an institution that would return it, knowing it might be returned and building anyway. The willows moved in the warm wind. The passage stood. Harriet Voss stood beside it in the July sun, 77 years old, a woman who had come to a mountain to end something and had ended up continuing something instead, and she understood that this was the best thing a life could do. Not finish, continue. She pressed her palm against the wicker wall one last time and felt it solid beneath her hand, and she thought of Maggie doing the same thing in September of 1947, walking through the completed passage for the first time and feeling the still air and the smell of cut willow and the particular satisfaction of a problem solved. She thought, "I know, Maggie. I know exactly what you felt." The wind moved in the willows. The mountain said nothing. It didn't need to. The firewood and carried it inside.